thou shalt not quit. There are certain commandments, although they're not explicitly articulated in the Torah, are actually implied in one or multiple verses of the Bible. And thou shalt not quit is one of those values. There's a curious and odd verse in the Torah reading of Toldot. The verse reads, Vayashav Yitzchak vayachpar et be'erot hamayim asher chafru bimei Avraham aviv. That Isaac went back and redug the wells, which his father Abraham had dug, and they had later been filled in by the Philistines. Achrei mot Avraham, after the death of Abraham, they were filled in. Vayikra lehen shemot k'shemot asher kara lehen aviv. And then they were called by Isaac the very same names that his father Abraham had called the wells. And so the verse tells us that Isaac redug his father's wells after they had been filled in by the Philistines, and he named the wells the very same names that his father named them. And of course the problem with this verse is that it doesn't make any sense. Who cares about wells, whether they were dug by Abraham or by Isaac? Who cares what names they were given? And who cares who filled them in and who redug them? And I never really fully understood this verse until the aftermath of September 11th. After September 11th, 2001, after Al-Qaeda had destroyed the World Trade Center, and a few weeks later there were questions about what would be done with the site of the World Trade Center. Should they just leave it there empty as a memorial to those who had died? Or should perhaps they consider rebuilding the buildings? And this, of course, was a question that many in New York debated. And when thinking about this particular question, I look back at this verse. And I realized that this verse was actually teaching us a very important lesson. And the lesson was, thou shalt not quit. You're not allowed to quit. And when it comes to destruction of the magnitude of the World Trade Center, one may be tempted to just sit back. One may be tempted to be passive. And the verse is teaching us, Isaac redug his father's wells. Isaac refused to give in to the forces of evil. Isaac even renamed the wells the very same names that his father gave them. This is the lesson of thou shalt not quit. This lesson is a lesson that has been very much a part of Jewish history from the very beginning. Last night I was part of a memorial service held by the Montreal Memorial Holocaust Center, in which a memorial was done for those who lived in Montreal who were survivors of the Holocaust and who had passed away in the previous year. And you have to think about this generation of survivors. This was a generation that had walked away after an enormous destruction. And they decided that instead of quitting, they would come back and they would redouble their efforts. They would rebuild. They would rebuild families. They would rebuild their community. They would rebuild institutions. They understood this imperative of thou shalt not quit. Isaac is redigging his father's wells, and that is the lesson that they understood. And indeed, if you've ever been in Israel, in the aftermath of a suicide bombing, and you walk past the store, or the shop, or the pizzeria the very next day, immediately they've cleaned everything up. They're boarding things up and they're beginning to make plans for new construction. They don't allow something that's been bombed to just sit there. They insist on rebuilding and rebuilding immediately. They understand the lesson of thou shalt not quit. Thou shalt not quit is a lesson that is an imperative for every human being, and it's a lesson that has really filled every moment of Jewish history. Isaac teaches it to us with the simple lesson of redigging his father's wells. And we have to relearn this lesson every generation and remember that it is forbidden to quit.